60% chance of U.S. recession.
Where stocks, bonds, and maybe the entire economy could be headed.
We have an immediate issue.
Huge flight out of the U.S. dollar.
It's very much like the 1930s. We have a breaking down.
The collapse of the U.S. dollar.
If the U.S. dollar lost all of its value, and that could happen literally overnight, what would happen to your savings, your mortgage, or even your job? And the bigger question, what happens to Canada if the dollar next door collapses? It's easy to assume that kind of financial chaos only affects the US. But the truth is, we're deeply tied to them. If the dollar goes down, we go down with it, hard. We can safely say it would shake up every economy. The housing market would be toast, exports probably completely frozen, and your investment would basically disappear. Forget cheap vacations in Florida. We'd be lucky to afford Tim Hortons. I know it sounds extreme, but this isn't a sci-fi scenario. Experts have been warning for years that if the world loses faith in the US dollar, the ripple effect would be global. And Canada is right next door when that tsunami hits. So today we're breaking down what could cause a US dollar collapse, whether it's ever happened before, and how it would impact you right here in Canada. If you're into finance, politics, and wild economic what ifs, hit the like button and please subscribe. I'm a Canadian entrepreneur of many successful businesses. I keep it honest and I break down the stuff into plain English. All right, let's get one thing straight. The US dollar is the most powerful currency on earth. As of now, it makes up about 58% of global reserves, and it is used in 88% of all international transactions. So, if it collapses, that's not just a bad day for America. That's a worldwide reset. But what would actually make the dollar collapse? Currently, the US national debt is over $34 trillion and growing by the second. At some point, other countries could lose faith in America's ability to repay their debt, and as a result, stop buying US bonds. The dollar could also collapse if the Federal Reserve prints too much money. Much like the pandemic stimulus, inflation can spiral out of control. If confidence drops too far, the dollar starts to weaken, and if that spirals, it's hard to get it under control again. And lastly, right now, countries like China, Russia, and even Saudi Arabia are trying to move away from the US dollar for oil and trade. If enough countries stop using it, demand drops, and that value comes down with it. Economist Jim Rickards once said, "When confidence in a currency is lost, collapse can happen overnight, much like a bank run." Is it scary? Absolutely. Likely? No, but also not impossible. Okay, so has a major currency ever collapsed like that? I mean, absolutely. Currency is not as big as the US dollar, but I mean, let's look at a few. Germany in 1923, hyperinflation made the mark worthless. People used cash to burn for heat. In Zimbabwe in the 2000s, inflation hit crazy percentages. And then in Argentina in 2001, debt default triggered a peso crash.
Mired in a deep recession, with escalating foreign debt and a currency pegged to the US dollar, the IMF cut off Argentina's financial support in early December 2001. The government announced what became known as a corralito, a fence. People could withdraw only a small amount of their money from banks.
Russia also experienced this in 1998 and 2022. Sanctions and the war crushed the ruble multiple times.
August 1998, and Russians are lined up outside the banks. The Kremlin just defaulted on its domestic debt, and people plunged into poverty by a threefold devaluation of the ruble are scrambling to withdraw their savings.
Even the UK, a stable Western country, had a currency crisis in 1992 when George Soros famously broke the Bank of England.
A unique day in London's financial markets ended with the Chancellor announcing that the pound was being suspended from the ERM and that the second of two dramatic interest rate rises during the day.
The US dollar hasn't collapsed before, but it has been devalued. In 1971, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, and inflation surged.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
In 2008, during the financial crisis, it lost value fast until people flocked to it again as a safe haven.
Down 1.7% here, a loss of 37 points or so. Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
The stock market is now down 21%.
So the dollar is resilient, but not immune. All right, let's talk about Canada for a minute. If the US dollar collapsed, Canada would get hit hard. And here are the top 5 ways. Number 5, our dollar would tank too. The US is our biggest trading partner. Over 75% of our exports go to them. If the dollar crashes, demand for Canadian goods plummets, and the loonie drops with it. You can basically look at it like their dollar just can't buy as much for the same amount as it previously could. Number 4, stock markets would crash. The TSX, the Dow, the NASDAQ, all would tank. Most Canadians have retirement savings in mutual funds, ETFs, or pensions, many tied to US markets. If the dollar goes down, investor panic goes up. That means market volatility, selling frenzies, and big hits to RRSPs and TFSAs. Number 3, inflation would go nuts. We import a ton of food, electronics, and fuel from the US. If their dollar crashes and ours goes with it, import prices skyrocket. That's bad news for all essentials like fuel, groceries, and even your Amazon cart. Reason number 2 would be interest rates would go wild. To stabilize a crashing dollar, central banks might hike interest rates pretty hard. That means variable mortgages get more expensive, lines of credit get squeezed, new home buyers, there probably wouldn't be any. If you thought 2023 and 2024 was bad, imagine double-digit rates again. And reason number 1 is political and economic chaos. When a currency collapses, it's not just about money, it's about trust. The US collapsing could trigger new global alliances, a push for digital currencies, civil unrest in the US, which always spills into Canada somehow. In short, instability, uncertainty, and chaos. Now, for the big question, could we prepare for this? I mean, yes, but I'd be lying if I said it would be easy. Canada could strengthen trade with other countries like Europe and Asia, as it currently is doing. Build stronger domestic production for essentials. Create emergency currency reserves like gold or other currencies. And explore alternative currency systems like digital loonie or crypto-backed systems. But realistically, we're still heavily tied to the US by an umbilical cord. So the best protection is diversity, both as a country and as individuals. So could the US dollar collapse? Probably not today, but the cracks are real and becoming more substantial. And if it did, Canada would feel it harder than most. Let me know in the comments, do you think we should start preparing for that kind of shock? All right, folks, if you found this breakdown helpful or you feel like you learned something today, please hit that like button and subscribe. I really appreciate your support. I talk about money, power, and the politics that shape our future from a Canadian perspective. Thank you so much for watching.